Hello all and welcome to our presentation for today's OW2 online conference. My name is Claire and today I'll be joined by my colleague Vivian from the Open Source Observatory team of the European Commission to talk about open source software policies across Europe. Thank you to OW2 for hosting us. Before diving into our overview on open source software policies across Europe, we will start by giving a little bit of background information about OSOR and what it is that we do. The Open Source Observatory, also known as OSOR, is a European Commission project hosted on the JoinUp collaborative platform. OSOR serves as a middle ground to connect European public administrations with other relevant stakeholders involved or interested in open source. It also continuously supports the dynamic community and promotes the use of open source software in the public sector. The general aim here is to be a trustworthy observatory providing open source software expertise and information. The content on OSOR is quite varied, including monthly newsletters, event listings for OSOR and other open source software events, and news about the latest developments in open source in the public sector. That being said, we're not just an observatory. OSOR strives to play an active role in the open source community by promoting open source software and helping European countries with its adoption. We regularly organise events ourselves and attend relevant events in Europe, such as this OW2 online conference. By doing this, we are constantly working to develop closer ties to the community and to keep OSOR relevant to your needs. OSOR also hosts the Knowledge Centre, which has been a key priority this year. The Knowledge Centre's content is continuously updated and includes case studies on the deployment of open source software within public administrations and country intelligence on open source software policies and initiatives within European countries. It will soon be enriched by guidelines for creating sustainable open source communities within public administrations. The open source software country intelligence reports are a key feature of the Knowledge Centre. The reports detail governance, political and legal frameworks, and any major ongoing initiatives pertaining to open source software in the 27 EU member states and the United Kingdom. Our initial desk research findings are being validated by national contact points, providing expert feedback on the status of open source software policies in their home country. At present, the publication of the reports is ongoing, but we are happy to share our findings from all 28 countries today.
Let's move on to the core of this presentation, a brief overview of open source software policies in 28 European countries. Please bear in mind that this is not a full analysis, rather an inventory of two aspects: public sector bodies addressing open source software and political and legal initiatives specifically addressing open source software across Europe. We will publish a more detailed report within the next 3 months. When we look at the map, we can see that 9 countries in total, ranging from dark blue to light blue, have one or more public sector bodies that address open source software explicitly from a policy-making perspective. The countries shaded in gray do not have a public sector body that addresses open source software explicitly. The role of these bodies with regard to open source software was found to vary, encompassing broad-ranging functions like coordination, implementation, support, endorsement, and policy making. There is one country with 3 public sector bodies, which is Belgium, where we identified the Flemish, Walloon, and Central entities. The singular body in each region has the responsibility of acting as a torchbearer in addressing open source software. In countries where 2 public sector bodies address open source software, these bodies may have varying roles. In Sweden, for example, the Agency for Digital Government is responsible for the functions related to policy making and adoption of open source software. Meanwhile, the Swedish National Procurement Services, with various initiatives, endorses and promotes the use of open source software. In Denmark, the UK, and France, one body is responsible for open source software, playing a leading role, working to implement and support open source software in their public administrations. For instance, the French Etalab within the Interministerial Directorate for Digital Services, or DINEM, works to implement open source software throughout government administrations and coordinates these efforts. Our research found that while some countries have multiple bodies responsible for open source software, the functions of these bodies do not overlap. Rather, the clearly defined role of each body seems to ensure that their work is complementary. We have just looked at the number and roles of public sector bodies with regard to open source software. This slide shows the specific breakdown of the types of entities that we identified. So there are 6 agencies in total, all of which are responsible for the oversight and administration of all policy matters pertaining to the digitalization of government. Open source software falls within their remit. Ministries are comprised of various offices, directorates, secretariats, and others. Within ministries, we identify 6 entities addressing open source software. When looking more closely, for instance, within the French DINAM, Etalab is active in supporting French administrations in the opening of their source codes and the use of open source software. Etalab also hosts a repository of open source software that can be used by public administrations. In Italy, the Ministry of Technological Innovation and Digitalization has entrusted the Digital Transformation Department responsibility for open source software. One core project of the department is the Developers Italia website, run by a community dedicated to the development of open source software solutions for Italian public services. Our research identified 4 services in Belgium, Spain, Sweden, and the UK. For example, the Spanish Technology Transfer Center is a directory of reusable applications and solutions available to all Spanish public administrations. Now, I would like you to take a look at the 2 post-its clarifying our definitions of legal and political initiatives. Legal initiatives are parliamentary resolutions, laws, directives, and decrees, and all of them are legally binding. Political initiatives are guidelines, declarations, governmental programs, and strategies which are not legally binding. The map offers an insight into the country's legal and political framework for open source software. We identified 14 countries which have political and legal initiatives specifically addressing open source software. 11 further countries were found to have political and legal frameworks that address open source software within the broad digitalization initiatives. As per our research, 3 countries did not seem to have any political or legal initiatives addressing open source software. We identified a total of 94 initiatives, of which 26 focus specifically on open source software, which represents 28%. These are in the countries shown in dark blue. The countries in light blue were identified as having published national strategies or digital services acts that include the promotion of open source software in public administrations, among others. Based on our research, these political and legal initiatives are usually part of the general digitalization efforts of countries. Here, we have clustered the most common domains that the initiatives address. For legal initiatives, we have identified 2 main clusters. The cluster on the development and use of open source software solutions consists of the legal initiatives that we identified that encourage public administrations to create their own open source software for internal use. We found 2 pieces of such legislation in France. The decree specifies the types of open source software licenses that can be used for administrative documents that are communicable and reusable, and the 2012 Aero Circular defined general guidelines for the use of open source software in public administrations. The cluster on the adoption of open source software includes specific solutions that public administrations should adopt, or specific guidelines on how this should be done as part of their policies or action plans. Based on our research, we consider this to be a key cluster for open source software because the initiatives in this cluster call on public administrations to implement open source software. As an example, in 2013, the Italian Code of Digital Administration made it mandatory for Italy's public administrations to use open source solutions, as well as to first consider reusing already developed solutions. Let's now look at the political initiatives. Based on our findings, there seem to be many more political initiatives than legal ones, as demonstrated by the numbers next to the clusters. These findings lead to the emergence of 2 new clusters. We chose to showcase some of the most recent initiatives. The open source software and procurement cluster highlights national documents that, based on our findings, set guidelines on how to fairly include open source software in public tenders and fairly consider open source against proprietary software, for example. In 2019, Italy's Agency for Digitalization published guidelines on the acquisition and reuse of software in public administrations. These guidelines provide instructions on the reuse of open source software solutions and standards and correctly choosing them according to needs. The cluster on the promotion of open source software includes the various political initiatives that we identified that call on public administrations to use open source software without, however, providing a specific program on how to achieve this. For instance, the Open Source Software Policy of 2019 was published by the Malta Information Technology Agency. It encourages the adoption of cost-effective open source software solutions throughout the Maltese public administrations, and licensing under EUPL is also favored. Within the development cluster, the 2018 French contribution policy for free software of the state defines the conditions for public servants looking to contribute to open source software created by third parties and encourages the publication of new software developed by the government. Looking at the cluster on the adoption of open source software, we see that Denmark's Aarhus municipality published an action plan in 2014. The municipality adopted this action plan as a continuation of its efforts to develop open source policy.
After the overview from Vivian, you might well be wondering, what's going to happen next? Firstly, we will publish all country intelligence reports by the end of June 2020 and gather additional feedback by email. Additionally, we aim to publish the full consolidated overview on the status of open source policies in European countries, so keep your eyes peeled for this report. Please do not hesitate to get in contact if you have any feedback or thoughts to share with us. All of our details are listed here, and we will be happy to hear from community members. The OSOR team would just like to thank you for attending today's online presentation. We hope it was interesting and that you'll join us on the OSOR community in the near future. Before we wrap up, there are just two more things to address. Here, we have a list of all the contributors to the OSOR team. Today's presentation was brought to you by Vivian and Claire, but please feel free to reach out to any of us individually if you have any queries or feedback. And finally, we're all aware why the OW2 conference is currently taking place online, and in this regard, the OSOR team has also been contributing to another initiative of the European Commission Interoperability Unit. Digital response to COVID-19 is a new repository on JoinUp. It is a live project which is updated on a regular basis, and it relies on your contribution. Contact us if you know any initiatives helping to fight against COVID-19. That's it for today. Thank you again for joining us, and we hope to see you on OSOR soon.